Hi everybody, hopefully you can all hear me. It's great to see so many people here. I'm Jonathan Hallett, the WA Division Secretary, and I'm joined today by Division President Cathy Moore, National Assistant Secretary Gabe Gooding, and your union Senior Legal Officer Kelly Thomas. Before we get underway, I'd like to acknowledge that many of us are meeting on the traditional lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. I'd like to formally recognise the elders, families and forebears of the Noongar people and acknowledge that they are the traditional custodians of the land and have been so for millennia. We acknowledge that the land on which we meet is stolen land, that the Noongar people have never ceded their sovereignty on these lands, and treaties are yet to be negotiated. This is one of a number of opportunities to get more information about the proposed National Jobs Framework. And while it might be heavy going, we do encourage you to review all of the documentation to ensure you understand all of the implications and opportunities that this framework provides us in the midst of an unprecedented crisis for our sector. So some housekeeping for this briefing session. It'll be in the format of a presentation and Q&A. We have a large number of questions that have already come through via email. Thank you to those who did that. We'll do our best to cover as many as possible during this session. Please also add your questions during the session either by emailing wa@nteu.org.au or using the Q&A function in Zoom. Any questions we don't get to, we will respond to after the briefing and get answers back to the questioners. You may have also seen that FAQs have been sent out regularly to address some of the misinformation that's been in the media recently. Now, we are recording this session, so if you'd prefer to not have your living rooms on display, now is a good time to switch off your cameras, which will also save us the bandwidth. We'll be running through the key features of the Jobs Protection Framework in this section. So what protections it provides against what our employers can already do under our existing industrial framework, what cost-saving measures have been proposed and the limitations on access to them, and finally, the process of union members voting on the framework and how it would be implemented if it's approved. But first of all, I'll hand over to Division President Cathy Moore for a quick overview of how we got to this extraordinary crisis for higher education in Australia.
Jonathan, I'm now unmuted.
Hello.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. So there are two really important facts about our current situation. The first is the crisis in higher education that's been triggered by COVID-19 is absolutely unprecedented. The second is that this crisis has been made far, far worse by the approach to higher education funding taken by several successive federal governments over the last 20 years. So to the first point, this is an unprecedented crisis in higher education. International student numbers have plummeted, resulting in a $5 billion revenue hole in the higher education sector for 2020 alone. That will grow to between 13 and 15 billion by the end of 2021. The average revenue shortfall for universities will be between 77 million and 118 million for each university. We are on the brink of massive job losses in our sector. Casual staff, because of the precarious nature of their work, were initially the most vulnerable. We've been fighting with some success to win special COVID-19 leave for casual staff at many universities, which we are continuing to expand. But as the scale of the crisis has become clearer, we can see that ongoing and fixed term staff are equally at risk. We're staring down the barrel of losing 21,000 FTE positions across the board. Without drastic action, thousands of our colleagues will be joining the lines of people at Centrelink before semester 2. We can't allow that to happen. To the second point, this crisis has been made far, far worse by the ideologically blinkered approach to higher education funding taken by successive federal governments over the last 20 years. It comes on the back of deliberate underfunding of higher education over the last 2 decades, and on the back of forcing universities to increasingly depend on international student fee income. And then the idiotic decision to tell international students to go home. And comes with the absolute certainty this government has no intention of helping the university sector if they can possibly avoid it. we have seen an $18 billion so-called rescue package rolled out by Dan Tehan, only to discover that it was largely composed of previously committed higher education funding. Apologies for the aeroplane noise, it's coming to get me. If anyone doubts the esteem in which this government holds higher education, the in-practice exclusion of universities from JobKeeper should put your mind to rest. A scheme that's been set up to minimise job losses was altered just to make sure higher education jobs would not be saved. And government was so determined to leave our sector twisting in the wind that they changed the eligibility rules 3 times just to make sure we couldn't qualify for help. We can't allow this policy, this mixture of neglect and contempt by the federal government, to continue. If we are to save jobs and ensure a future for our universities, we must win a real jobs rescue package, one with real new money, not accounting tricks. It would be an understatement to say we have our work cut out for us here. But if the government's actions over the last 4 months have shown us anything, it is that they can be moved. Scott Morrison isn't Abbott, the hard rights champion, nor is he Turnbull, the hard rights prisoner. He's someone who seems to have no firm convictions outside of his Pentecostalism. He is prepared to sway and bend with the political wind. So if we are to get his government to change their position, we have to bring a hurricane to his door and to Dan Tehan's. We must rattle the windows of every marginal MP with a university in their electorate. That's a big campaign ahead of us. And I hope that you'll start with joining me in the next stage of it, the National Day of Action, next Thursday. And by the way, if you haven't yet sent your letter to Dan Tehan telling him just what you think of this so-called rescue package, head to the NTEU COVID-19 website for a quick link to help you do it. But while we take the fight to the government, we also have to stem the bleeding. That's why elected NTEU representatives have been in discussions with Vice-Chancellors to produce this framework, preventing unpaid stand-downs, protecting workers' rights, and making sure job losses and redundancies don't occur until cash reserves are used, non-staff savings are exhausted, and yes, even the obscenely large salaries of the Vice-Chancellors themselves are cut. Our #1 priority is safeguarding as many jobs as we can and protecting our members' rights at work. I'm proud to be a member of our union. It's a democratic union in which every member gets a vote, a union of people that care about each other, that care about social justice and equity. We understand that there is strength in numbers, that we need to stand together because we are stronger together. And we need that strength to balance the power of our large, increasingly capitalistic institutions. Every member will get a vote on this, and I'm very glad that's the case. But as you vote, please remember to consider the reality of our current situation and that the Fair Work Commission has promised to expedite any variations to enterprise agreements brought by employers that arise from the COVID-19 pandemic. Today is an opportunity to get as much information as possible, facts, not fallacies, on which to base your voting decision. Please listen as Gabe lays out how this framework would operate. It's complex, but it's comprehensive. And in my opinion, it's the best shot we have at minimising the harm while we fight for a better future for higher education. A future that is about people before profits. Because real jobs, real careers are on the line. We owe it to ourselves, to our colleagues, and to future generations to get this right. So over to you, Gabe.
So thanks, Kathy and Jonathan. It's good to be back in WA, even if it's only virtually. I'd like to echo Jonathan's words in paying my respect to the Whadjuk Noongar people whose land I grew up on and lived most of my life on. And today I'm on the lands of the Wiradjuri people, and I also pay my respect to their elders. So as Kathy said, we're in an unprecedented crisis, and the union had some stark choices to make, and they were about what was most important to our members, and is that, and in the end, our decision was that jobs are the most important thing to our members. And it is clear that thousands and thousands of university workers will lose their jobs without some intervention. There will still be, let's be quite clear, there will still be job losses after this because the sector will inevitably shrink. But this is a 12-month, if you like, a 12-month plan to save as many jobs as we can and to put us in a good position as the economy recovers and hopefully as the enrolments recover as well. So Jonathan, would you like to go to the slides? Okay, so when we're looking at the situations saying, we all expected, I'll go back a step, we all expected that at some point the over-reliance on international students would come home to roost. The underfunding by the federal government didn't just produce an over-reliance on international students, it's also what drove the over-reliance on casual labour, and those two things have been really detrimental to the future of higher education, and there've been things we've been campaigning about for a long time. What we didn't expect was that the international student market would collapse everywhere at the same time and as rapidly as it did. So we started to look at what the employers could already do in the powers that they're given under the Fair Work Act and the laws. So what can they already do without the jobs protection framework? They can sack casuals, they can not renew fixed term staff, they can stand down staff without pay, and our estimate is that there's about 20 to 30% of professional staff who would be vulnerable to stand down without pay. They can effectively force staff to take permanent fractions or pay cuts under the threat of other measures. Many of them, in my view, shamefully have been putting a very hard word on their employees to donate salary and donate time with no protections for superannuation or leave or any of those other things. And most importantly, what they can do is they can propose their own changes to enterprise agreements with 24 hours notice. They don't have to negotiate with the union. They can just put it out there and ask their employees to vote within 24 hours. So that's the situation we're facing. Huge reductions in income, the capacity of employers to do very bad things to the workforce, and very little that we can do to prevent them unless we negotiate the sort of deal that we have done, which is the jobs protection framework. Next slide. So we went into this on the understanding that unless we could produce the things that are in the dot points on the left, unless we could produce an outcome that was not materially better for both jobs and pay than would have occurred without the framework, then we wouldn't accept it. So these are the things that we went into it with: to bring casuals and others who have lost their jobs back to work, to stop the non-renewal of fixed term contracts where the work's continuing, to prevent stand downs with no pay, to prevent forced redundancies as an across-the-board measure, to stop any external appointments during the crisis, so to make sure that if there are displaced people in a particular institution, the work goes to them, to make executives take a pay cut to their obscene salaries, and to stop uni capital works and to redirect money to staff. So it's a really complex document, and in a lot of ways it's hard to get your head around. So what you've been provided access to is the heads of agreement, which is a summary of the things that have been agreed. It's not the actual change that will occur to an enterprise agreement if members decide to vote for it. a national memorandum of understanding and a local memorandum of understanding. The reason why some things have to be in a memorandum of understanding and not a heads of agreement is because they're prohibited by law from being within a collective agreement. So the national MOU is basically the agreement of the people who negotiated the framework, that they'll recommend it to their groups and setting out the key parts of it. The local MOU would need to be signed by each university, and it covers some of those things in those dot points there: cuts to executive salaries, reduction in capital works, retention of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander programs, and most importantly, either returning to normal face-to-face delivery post-COVID-19 or at least going through the normal academic review processes before permanent changes are made. None of those things are allowable matters in a collective agreement. And then the guts of it, as it says here, is in the heads of agreement to be signed by each university if the members decide to go ahead. So how would it work? So what we've suggested and we're recommending is a variation to each existing agreement. The variation would be standard across the country and it would end on the 30th of June 2021. Now, I've had a lot of questions. One of my jobs at the moment is I've taken on answering all the emails that are coming into the National Office about this. There's a bit of confusion about it. People are saying there's no guarantee that it will end on 30 June 2021. Legally, it ceases on that date unless the NTEU, after a vote of members, and the university agree to extend it for a maximum of 6 months after that point in time. We would be highly reluctant to extend this agreement beyond 30th of June 2021, but we can anticipate a position where a couple of universities in the country will be perilously close to being insolvent at that point. So we'd like at least the capacity to extend in those places. But again, that only happens after a member vote. As with a collective agreement, all staff at the university would have the opportunity to vote on the variation. And to be approved, it's a majority of those voting that must be in favour of it. So we went into this wanting to protect jobs. And we wanted to protect people from the most serious impact in terms of income and employment. So this framework stops stand-downs with no pay. So stand-downs occur when the employee can't be usefully employed and it's due to a cause that's beyond the control of the employer. So public health regulations that prevent people going to work fits into that situation. So people whose work needs to be done in a particular location and they can't get there because of public health restrictions, that the employers are capable of standing them down. That's an indefinite period of stand down and it's with no pay at all. So what's in the jobs protection framework is if that situation applies, and we hope we don't go, we hope we come out of this shutdown and don't go into another one, but if we do, no one can be stood down without pay. They will retain some level of pay. And if that stand down goes beyond 30 days, then they can choose to leave with a voluntary separation package at that point. So that's the first thing about stand downs. It's particularly important for a wide range of professional staff. Secondly, it links redundancies to work, not jobs. This has been a problem in the Fair Work Act and something that we've been fighting about for a long time. Linking redundancies to jobs means the employer can just change the title of a job, boot someone out of it, call it another thing, and bring a new person in. In this framework, redundancies can only be made when the work stops. And so this stops across the board redundancies to save costs. In fact, there's only a couple of circumstances where they can make redundancies, and that's where they've permanently abolished a program, or they've closed a campus, or where there are excess staff in a particular work unit or in a particular function. But again, it's tied to work, not jobs. The framework also helpfully to protect those who want to stay, allows those who want to leave to go with voluntary separation packages, and they're required to offer voluntary separation packages at all stages through this. It prevents new external appointments, and that's to protect the people who are working in the university now, and to make sure that there's any displaced people, the work goes to them. It's particularly important for casuals. And that's why it also preferences displaced workers for all work. Most importantly for casuals, it mandates if the work done by casuals continues to be needed, it's done by casuals. So all those casuals who, well, not all of them, those casuals who have been laid off and the work is still continuing, they are entitled under the Jobs Protection Framework to get that work. And that will happen as soon as the framework starts. So work that has been transferred to ongoing staff and massively increased ongoing staff workloads, that work comes back to casuals if the casuals would ordinarily have performed the work and it's still required to be done. There's, if fixed term contracts come to an end and the work still exists, they have to be renewed. And if fixed term contracts have been ceased or delayed or interrupted during due to the effects of COVID-19, then the incumbent fixed term person gets the first opportunity and preference for that job. So the modelling that was done by the experts on our panel actually say this will save 13,500 jobs, but we decided to err on the side of caution and say at least 12,000 jobs will be saved by those particular measures. So, broadly under the heading of protects careers, where research can still be performed, it cannot be removed from academic work allocations. So if there's any research that you can fill up the time, then you still have to keep your research allocation. If your research plan is largely with work that can't be done because of COVID, things like it requires travel or it requires laboratory access that you can't get, then there may be some transfer to teaching. But if you can still conduct research within your research allocation, it has to stay. If research allocations are reduced, then research expectations also have to be reduced, and they have to be reduced, if you like, permanently, so that if there's a glitch in the research output during the period where someone's engaging in higher teaching, that is taken into account in any of the rolling 3 or 5 year models that people are currently subject to. Promotions and reclassifications will continue, but in all likelihood, the pay rises will be delayed until the 30th of June. It can modify the probation expectations. It's very, very difficult for people who are on probation to meet targets and expectations while we're in this working environment. So there's protection for people who are on probation. And for any performance evaluation, it limits the factors that are within the employer's control, and they must demonstrate that they've taken into account the impact of COVID-19 on any performance. Okay, superannuation. I can't tell you how many times I've answered this question, so I'm going to go into it in a little bit of detail. The framework will have zero effect on retirement incomes. The universities have committed to continuing to pay into UniSuper their contribution as if the framework had never existed. So irrespective of what happens to pay or to fraction, whether pay rises are deferred, whether increments are deferred, the payment to UniSuper will continue to be made as it always is, and your fraction will be reported to UniSuper as it is at the beginning of the Jobs Protection Framework. That will preserve both the service fraction and the average salary for every employee. People who are in the defined benefit fund will need to maintain their current contributions to UniSuper in order to maintain their total payout at the end of when they retire. But if they find that that causes them any level of financial distress, they will have 2 years to make up that gap. So Just to be quite clear, there will be zero effect on retirement incomes. The superannuation clauses have been negotiated with UniSuper to make sure that it's legal, it fits within their rules, and it absolutely guarantees people's retirement incomes. Okay, so some universities, we were successful in getting 2 weeks of paid COVID leave for all staff, including casuals. This would now extend it to any university that took part in the Jobs Protection Framework, stopping people from having to use their personal leave balances if they're sick or they're caring for someone who is sick. Nobody will be left without an annual or long service leave balance unless you choose to take all your leave. And the framework ensures that any action taken by your employer during this period will not impact on existing or future entitlements. So say you were subjected to a fraction reduction, your entitlements and everything else would continue to be accrued at the rate as if you were still full-time or whatever your previous fraction was. Okay. We're all aware that a number of people are particularly at risk during pandemics such as these. And that's a particular problem for those who are experiencing domestic violence. The framework provides for enhanced support for staff members who are experiencing domestic violence. It provides extra support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees because, somewhat shamefully in this country, being an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person makes you at demonstrably higher risk of COVID-19 infection and serious infection. Also includes special provisions for those who are in at-risk categories. So people who, for example, might have high blood pressure or diabetes, if they get a medical certificate to say that they're at risk, there'll be special provisions in place to prevent them being exposed when we return to work. And it also includes special considerations on all the actions for people who might be in financial distress, so they can be exempted from actions if they're in that position. So some universities are doing this, but a lot of them aren't. Under this framework, they would have to pay for out-of-pocket expenses due to working from home. You would not believe how difficult it was to negotiate that because they wanted to offset it against the savings in petrol that you might have made not driving to work anymore. Thankfully, some of the VCs saw reason and they will now pay for all out-of-pocket expenses due to working from home. Senior management will be required to take greater pay cuts than staff and before staff. There's joint union and management oversight of the implementation of the framework, which is through a local committee, which is 50% NTEU and 50% management. Decisions can be disputed and quickly resolved rather than having to go through the Fair Work Commission, which can sometimes seem to be an endless process and certainly takes a very long time. And the commission is stacked with anti-union commissioners now. Decisions can be disputed by a local agreed arbiter and quickly resolved. Most importantly to the structure of this is the National Expert Panel, which is again 50% union, 50% management, and this one has an independent chair. That panel accesses the financial statements of the university, the financial information, and the enrolment information. In fact, universities who want to sign up for this have to submit their information to the panel. That information is checked by an independent accountant to verify that it's correct and an appropriate methodology has been used. And then the National Expert Panel then looks at whether they've used other sources of money first, cuts to senior salary, cash reserves, suspension of capital works, or extended borrowing, and then puts them into a particular category, category A or category B. And the National Expert Panel also makes sure that the actions they take must be proportional to the severity of impact. We've seen one Vice-Chancellor come out already and say that his university won't be part of this framework exactly because of that provision, that they have to expose what they're doing to an external body. So having First of all, let's say all of the job saving measures apply to any university where has signed up for the framework, the members have voted for it and the employees have voted for it. They apply regardless of the financial loss. So it doesn't matter whether they're category A or category B or uncategorised, the job saving measures don't change. So these figures are how universities are determined to be in category A or category B. They were developed by a technical working group on which we had two very highly rated professors, a professor of accounting and an emeritus professor of economics with extensive experience in university finances, working with a couple of CFOs to work out where the category lines would be and what would be the best way, what would be the maximum that staff should have to contribute in either of those categories. Now, the first one, category A, is a total revenue reduction. That's probably my fault. A total revenue reduction between 5 to 10%. So that's on all of their revenue, or an operating cash flow margin of 3 to 6%. The 6% was confirmed by our experts by examining the financials of 22 universities who submitted them to us. And their assessment was that at 6% or less, universities were required to make structural change in order to be viable. Okay, so if their operating cash flow margin is above 6%, they can continue, but in bad shape. But from 6% and below, they need major structural change. In category B, that comes down to 3%. And the total revenue reduction goes up to 10%. So these are the universities that are severely financially hit. We estimate that 65% will be in category A and 25% will be in category B, with about 10% that won't meet the bottom threshold. So in category, what happens is the National Expert Panel puts them into category A or category B after having fully examined their finances. And that gives them the capacity then to implement deferral of wage rises, deferral of increments, and pay or fraction reductions. And the same in category B, but to different thresholds. How those are implemented is overseen by the local union and management committee. So it's important to understand in this scheme that in category A, the most that any employee can lose in any fortnight or over the entire year is 10%, and the most in category B will be 15%. It's likely that a significant number of members won't reach either of those thresholds. And then within that, that 10 or 15%, in category A, 5% is the limit that can be a pay cut, and in category B, 10% is the limit can be a pay cut. So if you're looking at someone in category A, they could have a 5% pay cut and then maybe a 2% for a deferral of a wage rise that was due this year. The other important thing to remember about the pay cuts is the first $30,000 is exempt. So if an employee is on $50,000, the 5% would only apply to the $20,000 above 30K, which works out to $1,000 a year or about $20 a week. If an employee is on $200,000, then they're paying the 5% on the $170,000 above 30K. So it's weighted towards the higher end of salaries. And importantly, casuals are exempted from any temporary wage reductions during this process. And we'll go on to safeguards, but just before, I'll go back to wage cuts, temporary wage cuts. There's been a number of queries from members about if my university's in category A, does that mean I will have to take a 10% pay cut or a 15% pay cut? The answer is absolutely not. They don't have to implement any of the pay cut or cost saving measures. They will no doubt want to implement some, but the National Expert Panel again has to make sure that they're proportional to the financial situation that they're in. So all that these two categories do is set out the maximum impact that can possibly occur to any individual. Okay. So what are the safeguards? So we know that universities are not particularly forthcoming or transparent with their financial information. So the fact that a national expert panel has access to their data is really important to make sure that we can be confident that they actually need to take the measures that they're proposing. The measures are temporary. They're only applied by following the structures in the framework, which is through the local committee, and they're proportionally applied in keeping with the financial stress. I've said before, the protections apply from the commencement, regardless of whether universities meet the thresholds, and the variation is time limited. So it absolutely ends on the 30th of June and changes are restored at that point. Who's in? So I've just said 10, 25, 65. We don't know who's in at this stage. It's clear that some universities, vice-chancellors are absolutely balking at having to provide their financials to expert panels. One vice-chancellor who's on $1.5 million is balking at a 20% pay cut, which would be $300,000. So he doesn't want to be in it. What is clear to us from the 22 universities that we examined when we were doing this work was that there were a number of universities who had serious liquidity problems at the end of 2019, before the pandemic. So that's not an excuse that we should have to pay for their previous liquidity problems, but it does indicate that the introduction of the pandemic will have a very serious effect on those universities, to the extent that at least one of them had $200 million less in the bank than they needed to pay their bills that were due in the next 30 days. Yeah. So it's a complicated piece of work. It has lots of moving parts, but ultimately the National Executive are recommending it to members because we need to secure as many jobs as possible. If we wait for the government to come to our aid, then those jobs will be gone and casuals won't be going back into work in second semester. And what we've needed to do in order to secure jobs is to give them some strictly limited capacity to cut costs, the most obvious of which is in wages. But again, with that proviso that they have to have spent a lot of their other money as well. It only reaches those who are in extreme financial stress, as we've said, and tested by experts, and it's shared across the staff with nobody going without pay. It'll save 12,000 jobs, and for us, the principle is really a strong union principle, and that is the strong look after the vulnerable. We all work together to protect as many people as we can. That's it. So what happens now? So the National Executive approved the agreement in principle in May. That does not mean it's a final decision. There'll be a meeting of National Councillors next week. If that's approved, the MOU will be signed, which is just the general intention to continue. The electronic ballot of all members will start on the 25th of May. And at some point after that, universities who want to be in the framework may put a ballot of the Jobs Protection Framework to all staff. So how is it enforced? It's legally enforceable through two mechanisms, and then I added a third one. Locally binding arbitration by an agreed arbitrator through the Fair Work Commission or through the courts. It's entirely legally enforceable. And I should add too that our intention is to be highly militant with the National Jobs Protection Framework. We will be prosecuting any attempt to get around the framework, and we will definitely be being highly militant in those branches where the universities have refused to give the commitment to transparency and job protection that this involves. So Q&A, how would you like to handle that, Jonathan?
All right, hi folks, I'm just turning on Kelly as well, who is our Senior Legal Officer.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear you? Yep.
Yep.
All right, over to you folks.
Okay, Kelly, do you have the document open?
Yeah, I do. Look, sorry. just been, we were, many members sent through queries before, in advance of this meeting. And so Gabe and I went through a few of the questions beforehand. Gabe, if it's all right with you, I'll just do a run through.
Sure.
Jonathan, may you please remind me how long we've got?
20 more minutes.
20 more minutes, okay. All right, so the first thing that I think we should attack is the questions about the Murdoch University workload, 80% teaching direction. I think that question has come up several times. And I should say that the division has put in a dispute about that direction now, and that will go through the usual dispute resolution procedures. I think this is a relevant example to highlight the interaction between the enterprise agreement and the job protection framework. So for those of you who don't work at Murdoch, Murdoch has directed staff to take on an 80% teaching load. The enterprise agreement terms as they are continue to apply even if the agreement is varied with the job protection framework. So members should take note that the terms of the enterprise agreement continue to apply to the extent of any inconsistency, then the job protection framework comes in. So the job protection framework as it relates to workloads say that where an academic staff member can't or is unable, is actually the words, is unable to perform work because of the crisis, then they can be allocated alternate work, which might include additional teaching work. From what we understand of what's happening at Murdoch, there is a more blanket approach to the allocation of that work, and that people have been just allocated more teaching. The process at Murdoch, as I understand it, is that there's a discussion that has to happen with the academic staff member before the sorry, just bear with me. I'll see if I can turn my video on, but I don't think I can for some reason. I think you might have to try and do that, Jonathan, if from your end, if that's possible. Anyway, so there has to be a discussion with an academic staff member prior to the reallocation occurring. If the job protection framework comes in place, then that reallocation can only occur if the work is unable to be performed by the academic as a result of COVID. This is a really important part of how the whole job protection framework works. Workloads are key. So if an academic has their fraction reduced as a result of the job protection framework or is unable to perform work, then that provides an opportunity for academics to work in accordance with the proper framework workload rules. And that then therefore provides an opportunity for fixed term staff and casual staff to perform the work that is needed to be performed at the university. In terms of one of the questions that come up was about fraction reductions and how that can be arranged in the workplace. The idea is to have a whole day fraction reduction. And I think those of you at UWA will have seen that is UWA's intention. There is ability in the jobs protection framework to come to a different arrangement. So it might be that you can take 2 days off in a month. It might be that you could, if you have family responsibilities, you could decide to take an hour off each day. But that is something that can be agreed between you and the university. Jonathan, you were going to ask some questions from the chat.
Yeah, so we've got a couple from Hamish and Anne. Are there any indications of what institutions are looking to join this framework and what happens to us if management doesn't sign up?
Do you want me to go with that, Kelly?
Yes, please. Yeah.
So in WA, UWA has obviously already indicated that they have signed up. The others have not yet. If your employer, because the laws, the Fair Work Act laws require the employer to initiate a variation. If they choose not to do so, then we'll be left in the position that we were trying to avoid in the beginning, which is unfettered management power and no transparency. So the more pressure we can put on the employers to join the jobs protection framework, the better off everybody will be. But as I've said, those on hyper high salaries are not keen, and those who don't want to expose their financial information to an expert panel are the ones that are likely to be more cautious about joining.
We've got one from Helene. Are the wage reductions based on gross wages? And what happens if government comes to our rescue via loans, for instance?
Okay, so if the government comes to our rescue, and that would be fantastic, the measures can be reversed at any time. So NTEU can go to the National Expert Panel, ask for a review of the finances, have the universities recategorised, and then the measures cease at that point. So it's designed to be flexible enough to allow that if we're successful in our campaigning on government, that the pay rises, the temporary pay cuts will stop.
Another question, Jonathan, that was submitted was someone, a casual staff member who had several ongoing jobs and says that this is now the first time that they have a prospect of no employment from when they first started at the uni. And as a mother of 4 kids, is unsure about finding work elsewhere to support needs. The question is, can the job protection framework do anything to bring back employment? The answer is yes. So, and this is what I mean by the workloads being really important to manage. If there is available work to be performed, then the job protection framework says that you will have that work again. The other thing to bear in mind is that the job protection framework protects people who could be in extreme financial hardship, such as being a single mother of 4 kids, protects against fraction reductions or temporary salary reductions where that can be demonstrated to the university.
Right. A question from Nadia. What happens under the proposed framework if down the track the NTEU says it's time to end, but the uni says it has to be extended?
It has to be by agreement. So unless both sides agree, it stops.
And how rapid is the rapid arbitration? Maybe could you explain what that would look like?
Kelly?
Yeah, it's very rapid, actually. If the CTMC doesn't reach agreement on a matter within 5 days, then it goes to arbitration with a decision within another 5 days. And that has a good impact on universities behaving sensibly. It means that they don't, if there's a quick turnaround to an arbitrator who could tell them to change their decision, it changes their behaviour to make them act more reasonably.
I might add to, just following on slightly from that, I know it was I think it was in Helen Gibson's question about, is there opportunity for more union representation? Yes, there absolutely is. So the local committee, which is the CTMC, more acronyms that we have to learn, is 50% union, 50% management. The people who are on that committee will be given fully funded time release to do their work both on the committee and outside of it. They'll be given opportunity to consult with people during working hours, both members and non-members. They'll be provided with access detail for non-members, and delegates will be given time release to also assist them in that work, and they'll be able to hold meetings during working time. So that's a considerable increase in union presence and the capacity to represent members coming through the framework.
Thank Thank you. Melanie's asked, I guess, what the proof is that this will protect jobs. So will those who have already lost their jobs get their jobs back? And will we know how much money this will actually save and whose jobs these salary cuts will save?
Okay, so the modelling on the how many jobs will be saved is on our website. It was done by the learned professors, and I don't claim to have as full an understanding of it as they do. Casuals who have had a reasonable expectation that the work would be theirs will get their jobs back. And it's a little more difficult for fixed term staff, but if the work is still required, then the contract is continued.
Can I also add to that, Gabe? When the university seeks its declaration from the National Expert Panel, it needs to demonstrate how many jobs it will save by making the cost-saving measures that it's asking the NEP to verify.
Kelly, do you want to jump back to a couple of the email ones?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So there was a question here, can staff initiate any of the proposed measures? The answer is yes. So if staff are working from home, they can seek to vary the span of hours that they currently work. They can reduce their own fraction, which is important for those with caring responsibilities as well. And they can seek to use the purchase leave schemes. If a university doesn't have one in place, it's required to put one in place. That's the sort of 4852 schemes. And that's important because we wanted to make them employee initiated so that no employee felt strong-armed at all by, school managers or so on and so forth at the same time as there being directions to take other impacts. There's another question about concerns that staff may have to take on higher duties or a role, not just lower duties, and who decides if you're capable or have the required skills. Look, there is the ability for the university to ask employees to do different work, different duties, so long as it's within their skill, competency, and it's safe to do so. It's an objective test, so if an employee feels that they don't have the skills or the competency, then, or it's not safe to do so, and safety includes mental health, then they can raise that issue with the CTMC, and the CTMC's role will be to determine whether or not an employee can perform those additional temporarily assigned duties.
Got a question from Steve. When can members expect to see independent reports on the financial circumstances of individual unis and which account for not only cash reserves, but the totality of financial assets, including investments? Curtin, for example, reported over 700 million in such financial assets in their last annual report.
Well, the members will see the published financial reports, which have quite a considerable a degree of detail in them. I do not think that the universities will be publicly releasing their internal financial documents and estimates until they've signed up to the protection framework, and they have to provide it to the panel.
Brian would like just to return back to the super issue, and just if you can clarify the defined benefit scheme issue that you spoke of. Sure.
So if you're in the defined benefit scheme, then your final retirement payout is a combination of a number of factors, including your average service fraction and your last 3 or 5 years salary average. So that if a service fraction, if a fraction reduction occurs during the time of the framework, say a 10% fraction reduction, the university will report your fraction to UniSuper as 1 rather than 0.9. If a salary reduction has occurred, then the university will pay the full superannuation as if the salary had not been reduced, and the same with deferred wages, wage rises. So superannuation will continue exactly as if the jobs protection framework hadn't continued. and they will report to uni super on both your salary and your fraction as if the jobs protection framework hadn't continued. If you're in the defined benefit, then you have to also maintain your own super contribution as if the jobs protection framework hadn't arisen. And if that's a difficulty, then there's a 2-year period after June 2021 in which to make up that difference.
Kate's asked about, will staff be able to choose the day they take their fractional reduction rather than having whole uni off at once? Spreading days will also help with social distancing. So can staff choose the days that they might take?
That'll be up to local arrangements, how they want to do that.
I'm just looking through the other questions, Jonathan, just hopefully covering off as many as we can. There were fortunately heaps.
While you're looking at that, Alexis has asked, does the 30,000 exemption apply to fraction reductions?
No, it doesn't.
I think here there's other questions around workload and how to manage the workload. Yeah, look, as I said, again, the workloads are key. So staff should not feel that they have to take on or perform free work for the university, even though there's been a fraction reduction. It's very clearly stated in the job protection framework that a person's fraction, one, can't be reduced if there's work that they have to continue to perform, or the work has to reduce to accommodate that fraction reduction that's being imposed upon them. And so that's really important to work in accordance with those rules, so that we can see casuals and fixed term staff coming back. And as Gabe said, to reiterate, you know, the union will be militant on the job protection framework. If there's not a reduction in work, then it's really important for you to let the union know.
There's a few questions about, I guess, retrospectivity of the framework. And so John's asked, does the framework address job losses and work reallocations that have already been put in place, or only those that occur post-signing?
Yeah, it does apply to cover people who have lost their job or took a voluntary fraction reduction from the 11th of March until the signing or the approval of the variation. And the 11th of March is the date selected because that was when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a pandemic. So people who are no longer working at the unis, but left after that date, you should get in contact with them to let them know that they could have rights.
Great. And Tracy's asked about, and it's just moved, protections around workloads for professional staff, because we talked a bit about academic workloads.
Yeah, look, so similarly, a professional staff member's workload can't be, a professional staff member's workload has to be reduced in accordance with any fraction reduction that is enforced upon them. And if there is any request to work in the period of the fraction reduction, then it can't be done without some kind of compensation. And that really looks back to the existing enterprise agreements. That might be toil, it might be overtime, so on and so forth. So yeah, that's really, there are safeguards to prevent free work from occurring.
And I realise we've just hit 1 o'clock. Maybe just a last one, which hopefully is not too long to answer. Stephen's asked, sorry if I've not understood, but is it all unis in or it doesn't happen?
No, it's not all unis in or it doesn't happen. because some of them definitely won't be in, and we think it's important to save as many jobs as we can. So no, it won't be one in, all in or all out.
Great. Thank you everyone for coming along, and to Gabe and Kelly particularly for helping out with some of those questions. From here, I guess I just want to give a plug to everyone around 21st of May next week, a National Day of Action. Look out for emails and check out the NDA website on the NTEU COVID site for more information as we rev up for increasing pressure on the federal government to deliver on a real rescue package that they've left us off the table for a long time. Thank you everyone. Those who put questions in that we haven't responded to, we're going to tally them up and get some responses to you, so don't feel left out. And this won't be the last time we have these conversations, so look out for local branch meetings and discussions as well over the coming week. Thank you.
Thank you.